Long ago, the lands of Armenia were ruled by King Ara, and King Ara was nicknamed the Handsome for the unsurprising reason that he was astoundingly good-looking. He was the Brad Pitt of ancient Armenia and then some. Every woman in the kingdom went weak-kneed when he walked past, and probably quite a few of the men too, for he was just stunning. Not only handsome, but charming and eloquent and engaging, with a winning smile and a twinkle in his eye. Everyone fell for his charms, one way or another, and that everyone included Queen Shamiram of Assyria. Now, Queen Shamiram was not an inconsiderable beauty herself. She was a remarkably glamorous creature, as well as intelligent and gifted politician who was able to play the political chessboard in the world of the ancient Middle East and into Europe and beyond. But like, well, as I say, almost the whole of the Armenian kingdom, on the day at a royal banquet, when the dignitaries from far and wide met and gathered to wine and to dine and discuss the doings of the day, Queen Shamiram finally cast her eye upon King Ara. In the flesh she had seen statues of him, she had seen minted coins with his face upon them, she had heard tell that he was handsome and charming and debonair and all of these things. But she, of all people, knew that kings and queens and emperors and empresses were somewhat prone to hyperbole when it came to their own self-promotion, and so she'd always been a little bit cynical in her perceptions of the allegedly handsome King Ara. But here he was, the flesh and the blood of him. He was witty and charming and funny. He looked good. He sounded good with that deep, rich, melodious voice. He even smelt good. Everything about him was alluring and wonderful. And she, Queen Shamiram, was used to having any man she wanted at the mere snap of her fingers. And so she made bedroom eyes at King Ara. But King Ara was immune to her charms. He had his own interests elsewhere, and she was not amongst them. And at first it was only a fluttering of the eyelashes, and then there was the fawning conversation, and attempts to praise him up and butter him up, and then there was the plying of the wine, and the summoning of the best poets and singers and acrobats from her court to come and perform just for him. But none of it really buttered any parsnips, as they absolutely certainly do not say in Armenia. It really made very little difference to King Ara, who was more than used to having women and men fawn upon him and go all weak-kneed and giggly and fluttery-eyed and racing pulsed in his presence. And this was just one more hopeful candidate. And he resisted. Not because he had ridiculously high standards, but because he had heard the reputation of Queen Shamiram as an astute political player, and he knew that whatever rather physical desires might be initially driving her interest in him, that there would undoubtedly also be schemes and plots and interests going on in her mind. And over the days of the great banquet, she tried and she tried and she tried, and he resisted and resisted and resisted. And she let her servants know that she would be interested in taking King Ara as her husband, and her servants let his servants know, and they let the king know, and the king was even less impressed by the prospect of marriage to the Queen of Assyria than he was by a simple roll in the hay with the Queen of Assyria. Well, the Queen, as I say, was used to getting her own way. She commanded, and it was done, both within her own lands and also in the kingdoms and realms beyond. People bent over backwards, forwards and sideways to please Queen Shamiram. And here for, well, perhaps not the first time ever, but certainly the first time in a very, very long time indeed, was somebody who said that straight word to Queen Shamiram that she was so unused to hearing. No. And it inflamed her ardour all the more. And when you've been told no once or twice, you might try a little harder and a little harder, and if you're very, very persistent, you've been told 3 or 4 times, you might still try again and again with bigger and bigger bunches of flowers and larger boxes of chocolates and all the rest of it. But there comes a time when you've heard no so often, it ceases to be a challenge and becomes, if you're the Queen of Assyria, an offence. And she determined that if she could not have him willingly, she would most certainly have him unwillingly. She would force his hand. And as the days rolled into weeks and the weeks rolled into months, and by this time everyone at the great banquet, of course, had returned to their own kingdoms, though the banquet didn't last that long, but people had returned. But the outcome, the ripple effect of what had happened at that banquet continued on for weeks and months as international politics began to take a darker turn, as Assyria began to rattle its swords in the direction of Armenia, demanding to know why such offence was being given that these proposals of marriage were being turned down. Well, I shan't bore you with the ins and outs of the politics of it, but one thing led to another, and soon the spears were flying and the arrows were flying and the swords and the shields and the axes and the clubs were battering one another. Blood was seeping deep into the battlefield. But even as her armies gathered and planned their next stratagem against the Armenians, the Queen made it clear to her generals: kill as many Armenian soldiers as you like, as many Armenian aristocrats as you like, as many Armenian generals as you like. The field can be knee-deep in their blood for all it mattered to her, but she insisted that Ara must not be killed or even so much as wounded. He must be taken alive. For when she wedded him, as indeed he would have to wed her if he were captive, she wanted him to be as perfect as the day she had seen him at the great royal banquet, with not a scar or a bruise, let alone a missing limb or a missing ear or a broken nose or any other form of disfigurement. She wanted him absolutely pristine. But Ara, for all of his glamour, was not one of these pretty boys who sits on a silk cushion sipping fine wines and sending other people out to do his dirty work. He was at heart a warrior king, and so he was upon the battlefield as surely as any of his generals or any of his troops. He was hacking and slashing and wielding sword and spear and shield, fighting alongside the rest of his men, seeing them cut limb from limb, seeing them slain all around him, just as he and they in their turn were slaying the Assyrian warriors. And the tide of battle was just beginning to turn in favour of the Armenians when someone, and it was never quite worked out who, let fly with an arrow. And maybe that arrow was just launched into the air in the hopes of killing some random Armenian, but luck or bad luck would have it that that arrow plummeted down to earth and struck King Ara in the heart, and he fell dead from his horse. As he collapsed onto the battlefield lifeless, there rippled a shockwave throughout that battlefield. The Armenians howled to see their king fall from the horse. The Assyrians tore at their hair, thinking what the Queen would do to them when she found out that the one rule she had given about not harming King Ara had been violated. Well, soldiers dropped their swords, their spears, their axes, their clubs as one on both sides of the clashing armies, and just looked in horror at the body of that beautiful, beautiful man lying there. And as they stood there, stunned, shocked, horrified, many of them, on both the Armenian side and on the Assyrian side, reported feeling things moving about the battlefield, as if a creature had gone past them from behind, and they would turn to look and there would be nothing there, or had brushed past them from one hand side or brushed past them from the other hand side, and again they would look and there would be nothing there. But it was like, some of them reported, those who had dogs at home, it was like some great canine when their friendly old dog back home in Armenia or back home in Assyria would brush past them. It was that feeling, except there was nothing there. And others reported a great flapping of wings, as if a legion of birds of huge proportion were coming down, and they looked to see eagles or some other vast bird coming down. But there was nothing there. Well, with King Ara dead, the Armenians, most of them, turned tail and fled the battlefield. Some tried to gather up the body of their fallen king, but at a screamed command from the queen, who was back in her tent safely, for she, unlike the king, did not fight upon the field of battle, when Queen Shamiram called to her loyalist followers, to her generals, that body was hers to be taken for her. Well, the nearest soldiers fell upon those Armenians trying to pick up the corpse of King Ara, slit their throats and took the corpse from them. And as reverently as they could, for whatever we may think of the politics of war, a king is a king, they carried that body reverentially back to the great tent of the queen and laid Ara before her. And aside from that arrow in his chest and the blood soaking the front of his tunic, there was no other cut, no other scar, no bruise, no injury upon that so perfect flesh. Well, the queen was beside herself. Her plans to marry this king and have him in her bed had been thwarted. Her plans to ally Assyria and Armenia, albeit through force, had been thwarted. And what was worse, she could easily foresee, without the aid of any prophet or seer or fortune teller, that as word spread back through the armies all the way back to Armenia itself, her name would be mud, and the Armenians, every last man, woman and child of them, would be out for her blood, would be out to rip her down and destroy her and topple every statue with her name upon it and eradicate her from history in vengeance for what she had done to their beloved king. And whilst you can vanquish armies from battlefields, lone assassins are much harder to deal with. And when you have an entire country that wants to kill you, you might manage to brush off the first half dozen assassins, but sooner or later someone would get at her. Well, she thought and she thought and she thought with that great brain of hers long into the night as to what she should do. And then it came to her, the idea. What would she do? What would she do? She would turn to the gods. What else should she do? The dead is dead, and none can bring back the dead. No physician, no wizard, no witch, no worker and weaver of magic, faced with a king with an arrow riven through his heart, there is nothing any of them can do. But the gods are the gods. Where mere mortal magic fails, they have the power of miracles. And so she brought her burliest servants and ordered them to build and make a bier on which to carry the body of King Ara. They removed the arrow from the wound, dressed him in clean clothes, took off the sweaty, muddy, grubby, blood-stained armour, made him look as regal as they could, and laid him upon this bier. And then, with the Queen in the lead, she on horseback, the others all walking on foot, carrying the platform with the body upon it on their shoulders, they made the long journey into the mountains. Up and up and up into the mountains they went, until they came to a plateau, high up, an hour's walk up into the mountains. And the Queen bade them to lay the bier down. And then she sent her servants to go back down the mountain, not all the way, because queens are never unwise enough to be completely alone, because you never know who's lurking, but to retreat some distance so that she would have privacy to do what must be done. And there she began to strew herbs around the body. And she began to sing, not songs of mourning and songs of grief, as would be appropriate at such a juncture, but she began to sing the songs of the ancient gods. She began to weave spells and charms amidst the prayers. She burnt incense, she leapt, she turned, she danced, she kindled fires, one in each corner of the bier, not to incinerate the body, but to send fragrant incenses and herbs and ancient woods up into the heavens to imprecate to the gods. And she called upon the Araleznir. And who, you might ask, are the Araleznir? Well, she had heard the stories told of what had happened in the aftermath of the death of Ara on the battlefield, of those people who had reported strange invisible presences, some of them like wings flapping of unseen birds, and some of them like large creatures moving about the battlefield, brushing against people's legs and brushing their sides, and how it reminded people of their dogs back home. And she put two and two together, dogs and wings, and two made four, made the Araleznir. For the great winged dogs of the heavens were known for their powers to resurrect the dead, and to come around the deaths of great heroes in a bid to resurrect them, and surely King Ara was a great hero. And so that is who she was calling upon and imprecating, to bring the Araleznir down from their heavenly realms, for they favour high places more so than they do the low places like the battlefield. And when she too began to feel invisible presences brushing behind her, brushing to the left of her, brushing to the right of her, when she too began to hear the sound of wings beating and feel the wind whipping up the way it will when large birds are present and flapping their wings, but still she, like all of the other people down on the battlefield earlier, could see nothing, she backed off into the darkness, into the shadows, back behind some boulders where she could be unseen and forgotten. And she watched, and in the smoke of the fires, with the ancient sacred woods upon them and the herbs and the incenses that she had cast upon them, she began to see shapes moving and shifting and turning and coalescing and taking denser form in the wood smoke, until she could see great dogs, big, huge dogs, with enormous wings like eagles growing from their backs. The Araleznir were here. She saw 2 of them, 3 of them, 4 of them, 5 of them, gathering round the body of the fallen king. And as tradition had foretold, so she saw it happen. One by one, each of the great winged dogs padded towards the body, snuffling around the chest where the arrow had gone in, and she could watch these smoky spectral forms licking at the chest of King Ara. For that is how the Araleznir heal the wounds of dead heroes. They lick them and lick them and lick them until the wound has gone, much as if it had been nothing more than a stain upon the body, in the way a dog will lick off stains of food from someone's hands until there's no sign of anything. So each of the winged dogs in turn licked and licked and licked at the chest wound where the arrow had gone in on King Ara, until at last the smokes began to die down and became less and less, and the 4 bonfires grew down just to smouldering embers, casting just enough light to see what was happening. And no longer could the Queen see any winged dogs. Whether they were still there but invisible, or whether they'd flown back to their celestial realms, she had no knowledge. But as she crept out from the boulder, eager, keen, inquisitive to see what was happening, she saw the body upon the bier move, stir, get up, aching, stretching, painful and awkward and difficult, until at last the king stood up, scratching his head and yawning and stretching as if he had been asleep for a great long time. He staggered and stumbled off the bier, past the bonfires, and then suddenly stopped as he cast his eye upon the Queen. And what he said to her, and what she said to him, well, one can but imagine. We only know her version of it, and that, of course, is possibly somewhat sanitised. But it was agreed that Ara would not marry the Queen, and the Queen would not press the issue, and that Ara would return to the Armenians and arrange peace between the nations. And this he did. And so the story of the winged dogs comes to an end, unless, of course, you know any fallen heroes who may need to be licked back into shape.